So thanks everyone for coming today. I know there are many of you probably calling in online as well, so thanks for joining us as well. I'm really thrilled to introduce today's speaker. We've been trying to get her in for a long time. Her name is Lily Simonson, and she is a professional artist who's been working for many years with oceanographers and marine scientists. She has fine arts degrees from UC Berkeley and UC Los Angeles. She, I think, kind of initially got into this work and world when she presented and showed work at the Census of Marine Life Decade of Discovery Symposium, and she was featured in several census publications. Her work has now been exhibited across the United States and Europe and has appeared in numerous media publications. She's taught painting and drawing at the University of California, Berkeley, the Norton Simon Museum of Art, and California State Polytechnic, Pomona. Lily's been to sea 6 times. The first of those was on the Unal's vessel Melville, which is how I met her. And she was the NSF Antarctic Artists and Writers Program awardee, where she spent 3 months scuba diving beneath sea ice and camping in Antarctica. Her most recent work is on exhibit right now at the Harvard Museum of Natural History. It'll be on exhibit through June, so if anyone is up in the Boston area, I highly recommend it. This was one of my furlough activities, and it was awesome. Fantastic exhibit, and also a great museum. Please join me in welcoming Lily Simonson.
Thanks, Amanda. When I was sending Amanda my bio, I mistyped, or my phone auto-corrected, a decade of discovery to a decade of discos, which actually is like a surprisingly fitting theme for the Census of Marine Life and my connection to them. And it relates to the Yeti Crab, which I'll explain all about how that became my muse. But the Yeti led me to the Census of Marine Life, and then there was a dancing Yeti crab discovered. So it really is a decade of disco. So I'm just going to explain how a California painter who hates being cold ended up in Antarctica and in the deep sea. And this image is meant to just sort of show the scale of my work. Anyway, it begins with the common lobster. So when I was growing up, I was just obsessed with lobsters. And when I started to become an artist, I made this series of mammoth portraits of lobsters like 7 feet long. I was interested in how they sort of echoed the human body, how what's sort of invisible in our bodies was visible in the exoskeleton of a lobster, but it was very sort of artsy, art historical perspective. Sort of parallel to that, I developed a body of work of moths, and bear with me, this will relate to the deep sea. So I spent several years just painting moths, and that was based on a childhood phobia of moths. So again, I was exploring like these elements of the natural world, but related to very human-centric ideas. And so I had these 2 series of paintings. And then one day when I was in grad school at UCLA, this was in 2006, so it's been a little while, I opened my inbox and I got an article, a New York Times article forwarded to me by like 6 different people about this newly discovered animal called the Yeti Crab that was described as a lobster with the fur of a moth. So it seemed like this really weird kismet thing where I just, it was sort of meant to be that I had to start painting the Yeti Crab. And so here is the sort of transition to the Yeti paintings from the moths. Of course, I like to paint from life. So when I was painting those other things, I would catch moths and have them in my studio, buy lobsters at the grocery store. So I needed to meet the Yeti Crab in person so I could get a feel for what it really looked like, because you lose so much information in a photo. And this will become a theme throughout my career. So I went to see the only specimen at that time, which was at the Museum of Natural History in Paris, and I have its face censored because they had just described it and they didn't want me to share any photographs of it. So I'm protecting its identity here. So I made a bunch of sketches of it, and then from those drawings made a whole series of paintings of the Yeti crab. And when I started working, when I met the scientist that was studying it, Danielle Guinaud, and began this series, it occurred to me that in painting something that was newly discovered, I was actually aligning myself with this amazing trajectory in art history and in naturalism, where artists and scientists used to be sort of, they very much overlapped, and often scientists made paintings. So I began to be more and more interested in that lineage. Here are some examples of artists, scientists that I really admire. This is Marion, who in the 17th, early 18th century funded her own expeditions by selling paintings, and worked with the German government, and she was Dutch, I believe, but then worked with the German government, and she was just an amazing figure, and was the first person to describe metamorphosis, which is pretty amazing. Then, of course, Haeckel, another naturalist painter, and Audubon, who I actually grew up copying my dad's field guides for birding, so he's been a long-time influence. So I spent several years just painting the Yeti crab. During this time, a couple more species were discovered. I need a little water break. So this is the Hoff crab, which has, if you're not familiar, the Yeti has seedy covering its pinchers, which help it, basically, the seedy transform sulfur into energy. So they have bacteria on them, and then the Yeti eats the bacteria. So it's part of this chemosynthetic community. The original species they found lived around hydrothermal vents, or lives around hydrothermal vents. Then they discovered another vent Yeti that actually has a furry underbelly, which is why it's called the Hoff crab, named after David Hasselhoff. So I, of course, needed to visit the Hoff crab. So here I am in Southampton. Again, its identity is protected. I think it had not yet been officially described when I got to meet it. So the Census of Marine Life got me an in there. So then I did this series of that other species, and then one of Amanda's colleagues at Scripps, Andrew Thurber, discovered yet another Yeti crab species, which is the one I mentioned, which dances. So this is off the coast of Costa Rica. They again have the seedy on their pinchers, and they have this amazing behavior where they wave their pinchers back and forth in front of their bodies or above their bodies to sort of stir up the sulfur. So they're not a vent species, they're actually a cold seep species. So the theory is that they're stirring up the sulfur so that it's not erupting in this dramatic way. Or perhaps they're just disco dancing, a decade of disco. So I tried to create a party atmosphere in my Kiwa Porta Vida paintings. And then through the Census of Marine Life and working with Andrew, who I reached out to after I learned he had discovered a Yeti crab species, I met Lisa Levin at Scripps, who began to convince me that there are more organisms in the deep sea than just the Yeti crab. So I began to expand my horizons and borrowed more and more specimens from the Scripps collection. I was living in LA at the time. So I started painting more and more deep sea creatures. Here's a Riftia painting with some spider crabs. Those jellies are obviously mid-water, but artistic license. Anyway, at a certain point, I had been working with Lisa Levin's lab for a while, and she suggested that I go to sea. And I thought that was a great idea, and that actually transformed my practice. So I went from painting these preserved specimens, which had no pigmentation, to getting to see organisms as they're freshly collected. And one of the things we were doing on this cruise was a lot of multi-coring. So we were collecting cores of sediment and sieving through them. And one of the texts on the Melville suggested that I use the leftover sediment as a medium to paint with. So I started making a mural every day on the ship van of an organism that we would collect from the sediment using the sediment itself. And then I'd wash it off the next day. This is a sirachalid worm, and do another mural. These are phoriums called mud balls. This is a mud owl, a type of polychaete, an acarax clam. This is a hermit crab in a scaphoid shell, an octopus, a spider crab, a brachiopod with some phoriums behind it. And then I used those sediment paintings as sort of studies for more permanent paintings in oil or acrylic. So this is a brachiopod painting. And then this is the exhibition I had that was based on my work with Lisa, which got a great reception, and it was really my first taste of what it's like to bring actually the scientists into this sort of art realm. So I had Lisa and a couple other scientists that I've been working with come into the gallery and present on their research. So it gave them a chance to share their work with a sort of humanities audience that might not otherwise be exposed to it. And when I first started working with Lisa and other scientists, they were like, well, this is really great because you can get the public engaged with what we do. And in my head, I was like, I don't know if the public really cares about art either. But it turned out that there was something about that sort of symbiosis of two disciplines coming together that I think did create a really engaging narrative for people, and ended up having this sort of snowball effect where both our work ended up getting a lot of press and attention that it might not have otherwise gotten. So it has worked out the way that Lisa anticipated in a way. So that's been really amazing. So as I mentioned, I had started working with Amanda's colleague at Scripps and Lisa's student Andrew Thurber because of his Yeti Crab discovery. But he explained to me that actually his main interest at that time was worms in Antarctica. And he showed me images of scuba diving under the sea ice in Antarctica and what the environment was like there. And I started making paintings of those worms based on his preserved specimens. But I decided I really, really wanted to go to Antarctica for myself. So I began, he said, well, you're in luck. There's this program for artists that the National Science Foundation supports. So I began this process, this several-year process of learning to scuba dive so that I could write a proposal to scuba dive under the ice. And in the meantime, we presented our work at a conference at SCAR, and another geologist saw our poster and invited me. He said, well, you can wait a couple years to find out if your proposal gets funded, but you can also just come with me now. And if you help with the field work, you can sort of paint on the side. So I first went to Antarctica in 2012, and we were in the dry valleys. So I sort of moved away from marine stuff, but of course this is still a thermokarst pond, so still painting water-ish things. But the main feature we were studying was this buried glacier, which is really interesting because it's exposed. You can see the strata of ice and till. There's a river that runs in the summer, so it's eroded the face of it. So you can see the layer of till and then ice and then till. So this is the 2% of Antarctica that's not totally ice covered. And they used to think it was just there wasn't ice, and then they discovered that there's ice underneath most of the dry valleys. And that's for scale that's me painting down there. I'm wearing 3 parkas, I think. So this is the body of work that I made based on what I did with the geologist Joe Levy. We were also looking at the movement, sort of the hydrology of the dry valleys. This is Don Juan Pond. It's the saltiest body of water on the planet. It never freezes, even in Antarctic winter. So I made these sort of plein air paintings there, and then would make bigger versions back in the studio. And then this is the presentation of that work in the gallery. And again, I invited Joe and Mary Miller, who's another sort of science communicator who's done work in Antarctica, to speak about their work in the gallery. And then I learned that my proposal to go back did get funded. So I went back in 2014. Here's me modeling my dry suit. So this is what the edge of the sea ice looks like if you're not familiar. So the McMurdo Sound is the largest expanse of sea ice in the world, and it's covered usually in about 6 feet of sea ice. I shot this from a helicopter, so it's hard to tell the scale, but this is an iceberg that's probably like 10 stories high. And so closer to town, to McMurdo, you drive in one of these guys across the frozen ocean to your dive site, and they cover the dive hole in these huts. So they use a big drill to make the hole and then cover it with a hut to keep it from refreezing. And then while you're under the ice, somebody stirs the hole to make sure you don't get stuck under there. So I did get to do a bunch of dives under the sea ice. That was the video that was playing when you walked in. And it's a really spectacular environment. So it's October, November when you're diving. So it's been dark for many months, and you can see actually close to 1,000 feet. So it feels like you're not even in water. It feels like you're flying through the air or something. And there's no sort of macrofauna, no seaweed, and it's just this sort of volcanic seafloor, so all the critters really, look very stark against the seafloor. So you can see, just feels like you can see forever. So I got to collect the organisms that I wanted to paint and keep them alive in the lab at McMurdo. And then I had a little studio at McMurdo where I would paint based on what I'd collected. So these are nudibranchs. These are Cleone pteropods. And there I met Gretchen Hoffman, and she was studying how the Limacina pteropod might respond to ocean acidification and warming. So I did a series of Limacina paintings that was inspired by her work. And this is a video that's not going to play, but I basically fell in love with the landscape too. The sea ice makes these really amazing formations. And I thought when I wrote my proposal I'd get to dive a few times, but the contract divers, I think they enjoyed having an artist around, so they just let me tag along with them on every dive. So here I am celebrating my 25th dive in my hot dog costume. So on each dive, in addition to collecting organisms, I took video of everything. So this is the sea ice, which has microalgae or diatoms that grow in it that make it glow sort of neon green and gold and turquoise. And it just makes these amazing brine channel formations. So I ended up painting a bunch of landscape-based stuff. This is a submerged glacier, so the white golf ball texture is the glacier, and then the colorful stuff is the sea ice on top. This is a brine channel, and here's me in my studio. I use this very sort of complicated process where I do the entire painting with regular paint and white light, and then I redo it with fluorescent paint and black light, so you can kind of see the two ways I work. And I got into that partly because I was painting things that fluoresced in the black light, like creatures that would fluoresce. But then I continued with it in Antarctica because it was just the best way to show that luminous quality of the sea ice. So again, I would make these sort of small-ish paintings at McMurdo. So there's the nudibranch painting. It's actually 4 by 4 feet. And then ship them back to my studio in California and then make bigger versions there. So this is a seal diving under sea ice. And again, this is my work presented at the gallery. And I invited Gretchen Hoffman and Joe Levy and Rob Robbins, the diver, to speak about their work. And of course, I modeled my dive gear at that panel discussion as well. And again, got some great coverage for the collaboration. And then I finally got lured back into the deep sea by Peter Gerges. He invited me to join his lab on a trip on the Atlantis to the East Pacific Rise. So we were looking at Riftia, and there were some geochemists on board who were also collecting chunks of chimneys. So I've actually been interested in tube worms my whole life too. I was a tube worm for Halloween in 2nd grade. So I was kind of getting back to my roots here as well, but this was the first time I had been able to paint tube worms while they were still kind of alive. Pete does really interesting work with a pressure van where he can actually keep tube worms alive on the ship. So that was really thrilling for me. And could you cue up the first video? One of the scientists in his lab, Kiana Frank, documented my process. Oh, it's that one. Yeah.
Arch a bit so I can see, yeah, and stretch out of the tube. Beautiful. Yeah, I want to see a little bit more of the blue. Yeah, just fluff up right there. Magnificent. Perfect. Yeah, just twist a little so I can see more light. Excellent. Beautiful, beautiful. Don't move a muscle. That's perfect. Wonderful. Yeah. Just hold that. Oh, don't move a muscle. Beautiful.
That's a glimpse of, yeah, what it looks like. That's me in the wet lab on the Atlantis, so I got to turn that into a little studio, and that's the outcome. That's a painting I made based on the Riftia. So I made that on the Atlantis, and then this is based on the chunks of chimney that the geochemists were collecting. And there's the little Alvin lasers. Here, I'll point to the laser with my laser. There we go. And then again, I sort of used those smallish 30 by 40 inch paintings as studies for larger works back in my studio. So this is a 5 by 7 foot painting based on the vents and the Riftia sort of in the distance. And again, we've seen that shot. Here's the large version of the Riftia painting. So this is also 5 by 7 feet. And these are both on display at my Harvard show. And then I got a chance to sail on the Atlantis 6 months later and actually dive in Alvin, which was really thrilling for me. Here I am in the hot dog costume again. I have to admit, though, that I was not allowed to actually dive in the hot dog costume because it is polyester and the sub is oxygen rich, so you have to wear natural fibers. So if I ever get a chance to dive in Alvin again, I'll be sure to make like a cotton or wool version of my hot dog costume. And then this video is probably not going to play, but the especially exciting thing for me was that I kind of came full circle, because obviously I would have dove in Alvin anywhere in the world, but this dive happened to be off Costa Rica at the Cold Seep where the dancing Yeti Crab lives. So it's kind of like I finally got to meet my muse in person. So I had been painting the Yeti Crab for 10 years, 11 years at this point, just from preserved specimens. And this time I got to see them, in person, if you will, dancing, and we got to collect them and keep them alive on the ship. So that was really exciting. So this is me sketching in the sub, and then based on those sketches and the Yetis that were on the ship, I made this painting of some Yetis reaching out of mussels. The tinfoil hat is a Alvin hazing thing, so ignore that. We also were collecting a bunch of lamellobrachia, which are a cold seep tube worm. So here I am with our lamellae. And then this is the sort of larger version I made back in my studio. Again, this is 5 by 7 feet, and we've got our collection of Yeti crabs. They kind of cluster around each other, the adults, and then the babies are in all the little carbonate crevices, sort of waving their arms. And then Amanda got me interested in midwater stuff, where she's been advocating for painting midwater stuff for a long time. And so I was preparing this show for Harvard, and to sort of complete the picture, I realized I wanted to convey sort of the experience of diving in the sub, and one of the biggest surprises for me was actually the range of bioluminescent organisms that you can see when you're going through the midwater. So I was familiar with sort of scattered bioluminescence on scuba dives in the dark, but I had not seen or really understood how many, like how common and the range of shapes and colors and sizes that you see sort of zooming by the portal. So this painting is based on critters that I remembered seeing. So this is one of the few paintings I've done mostly from memory, but also with help from some scientists that Amanda generously connected me with who study bioluminescence. So Brennan Phillips and
Steve Haddock,
yeah. So thank you to them. A year later, I guess, I went a little closer to home with Pete Gergis's lab. So this is off the coast of LA at Point Dume Seep, and we had a chance to test some really exciting technology. This is a deep sea optical modem that allowed us to send lots of information from the lander to the ROV using just this blinking LED light. So pretty exciting technology where you don't need a tether to communicate tons of information. You know, without this, we basically just have acoustics. There's no Wi-Fi, no GPS. So this was pretty exciting, and we were at a really cool site where it's another cold seep, so you've got methane and sulfur seeping up, but instead of the microbes forming, you know, rock-looking carbonate, they form these carbonate structures that are like, they call them chimneys. They're these crazy biomorphic formations. So I have actually now visited that site twice, so once on the Melville and once on the Falkor, and done a series based on those really cool structures. And there's the optical modem in the background, that blue light. Here's another painting based on that. And when I was on the Falkor, I got to do something super exciting. I think I may be the first artist to make a painting with an ROV mechanical arm. So that was a really fun group of people, and I have a time-lapse video of that. So we'll just switch. Yeah, but they were very, the Falkor is very into, the Schmidt people are very into outreach. So they were, again, it was a tech who came up with the idea that I used the ROV arm to paint, and then the team was really cool. I couldn't believe they let me near that thing. And it's actually even more difficult than it looks to use the manipulator. I mean, those pilots make it look really easy, but the manipulator is divided up into all these little segments, and it's really not that intuitive. And then, you know, we said we were going to do it, and then all of a sudden, like, the entire science party and crew and like everybody's like on the deck watching me, and they're like, we've only got 15 minutes before it overheats. So it was a little stressful, but I think I did okay. So this is a painting of the lander that the optical modem was attached to. Pete actually would not like me to just say optical modem. There's all this stuff on the lander. So it's called the Abyss, and there are all manner of sensors, all kinds of ways of collecting data, and then the modem just, relays that data. So the lander is more than just a modem. And so this is the series of paintings back in my studio that I made based on all these recent expeditions and shipped off to Harvard. I threw in one Antarctic painting, so the focus of the show is the deep sea, but I can't stop painting Antarctica. So this is a sea ice painting with microbial mats. Underneath there is a seep off McMurdo that's pretty cool. So it's called the cinder cone seep. So this is the show that's up right now. It's up through the end of June if you happen to be in the area. Hopefully there won't be another furlough, but if you find yourself with time on your hands, like Amanda did. And this is my contact and my email at the bottom. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Do any of your paintings use luminescent paint or things that would react under fire?
Yeah, that was so I use fluorescent paint, which does glow under black light, and so I usually show the work with a combination of white light and black light, so you get this full range of color where you have the non-fluorescent colors and the fluorescent colors. So that's sort of the best case scenario. I think it would be really cool to use just luminescent paint. And actually, when I started working with Steve Haddock, he was a little concerned about the confusion between fluorescence and bioluminescence. And so I think and I sort of convinced him, well, it's like a way to talk about this difference. But it would be great if I could use just luminescent paint or phosphorescent paint. Unfortunately, there aren't that many colors available, so like there's really only one color available as paint. I mean, there are artists who do use like bioluminescent bacteria and stuff to make these like temporary paintings, but it's a sort of a very different thing. So we just need to discover more like creatures that can make more bacteria that make different colors, like more red. It's out there, I think, but yeah, blue and green are more common, but then it's sort of a limited range. Yeah.
I guess from what I've seen in museums and galleries that for a few hundred years, painters haven't felt like they have to necessarily make a picture look like a photograph, or the shapes or colors don't have to be exactly like reality or maybe have any. But you're affiliated with a scientific mission and you're painting these things for a special reason. I'm just curious, like, to what extent, what is your, like, you feel like you need to be in some way, like, accurately reproducing what something looks like?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because I usually talk about that in my talks, and I didn't really mention it today. But so I'm very into this sort of lineage of artists, naturalists, right? But because we have digital photography and scientific illustration as sort of their own very highly developed mediums and fields, when I go to see or work with scientists, I'm not tied to representing sort of the exact morphology of what something looks like. So I have a little bit more freedom, especially in this context of contemporary art where things aren't always tied to reality or naturalistic. So while I do like to represent what something looks like, I also have freedom to exaggerate certain things and highlight certain qualities and create like an atmosphere and sort of tell a story. And I also really like sharing my work in this art context because people often see my paintings who aren't familiar with the subject matter and think that I'm painting something invented. and then it's this really exciting moment where they realize, either from talks or from the wall text or whatever, that it is based on something that's real, and so you get this whole sort of joy of truth being stranger than fiction thing, which is really exciting. So there are these sort of two audiences for my work. One that is totally unfamiliar with the subject matter and enjoys learning that it's real, and then one that is intimately familiar with the subject matter and is like, oh my God, I can't believe you're painting this obscure organism that I've studied for decades. So both audiences are very fun to connect with. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. And I guess I also wanted to mention that's part of why I like painting on like deep sea stuff or Antarctic landscapes, things that are not typically familiar, because it does give me an opportunity to engage with the contemporary art world that's more interested in sort of tweaking reality or abstraction. So I get to play with these ideas that are relevant in art today, while enjoying the natural world and representing things that I'm passionate about, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I like the scale of the paintings that you do, but I was wondering from you why you choose to do them, so large.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I like to do is, instead of in our daily lives, we look at so many images on screens and phones and stuff. So I think it's really fun to, instead of bringing these remote worlds to the viewer in smaller images, I sort of bring the viewer into the remote world by making the painting bigger than they are. And then I also like to invite the viewer to identify with these organisms. So often I'll make like a tube worm human scale. I mean, tube worms are 6 feet long, but they're skinny. So the ones I paint would be even longer because they're fatter. So yeah, but I also make small paintings. I think it is pretty challenging to make a small painting be as compelling as a big painting. So that's a challenge that I enjoy playing with. And something that happened when I went to Antarctica is my move had always been taking these tiny creatures and magnifying them. But even when I make a 6x8 foot painting of an Antarctic landscape, you're shrinking this space, and when you're there, it's so vast. There's obviously no foliage, no buildings, so there's no sense of scale. So it was also a really interesting challenge to represent that expansiveness. And one of the things I did was I made a series of abstract paintings based on the landscape there, which I didn't really talk about today, but that was one way that I tried to sort of tackle it, because it feels kind of like you're in an abstract painting when you're there. Yeah.
What are some of the challenges of painting on a ship?
Well, what are some of the challenges of painting at sea? It's definitely more challenging than working in my studio where nothing's moving and I have lots of space. But I would say that I admire scientists who sit in front of a microscope for hours at sea. That seems a lot more difficult than painting, but I do have to tie down my easel and tie down my canvas, and I did switch from oil to acrylic when I started working in the field with scientists, because oil is just terribly messy. It takes so long to dry. So the first thing I do, though, when I get on a ship is I cover everything in plastic so that the ship's crew doesn't get frustrated with me for getting paint everywhere, because I am sort of messy when I work. And then, obviously you have to prepare for rough seas. It's really nice to be in the lab with scientists, like in addition to getting like to look at the organisms as they're freshly collected. I get to get an in-depth feeling of the research itself, so I get to help with field work, and it gives me a much better understanding and a much richer understanding of what I'm painting, which I think comes into the painting itself in sort of nebulous ways that are hard to describe, but then also when I'm sharing my work with new audiences, I think I can talk about it in a more interesting way, and that comes through interacting with the scientists like every day throughout the day. And then it's fun getting feedback on the painting itself as I'm working, like even though I'm not trying to be photorealistic or illustrate exactly what things look like, it's nice to get a perspective on from somebody who really knows the organism or the environment super well. Yeah, and so that's a plus. But then the challenge of that is I tend to get like interrupted every few minutes. So it's a delicate, which I like, but it's, you know, it's very different than working in my studio. So yeah, you're sort of, or I find myself, it becomes almost like performance art or something, because everybody is like coming through and looking at what you're doing all the time, which is, you know, normally painting is a super private thing. Yeah.
And we have another online question from someone who wants to know, will your art go on tour?
I have gotten the opportunity to show sort of all over. I don't have any specific like tour planned, but if they have some ideas, my email's at the bottom of the screen. But yeah, it's been great to be able to show, you know, near where I live and then also across the country. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Just wondering if you were interested in any other creatures right now, or something that you'd like to look at in the future potentially.
Yeah, well, I am more into midwater stuff. I'd always been a benthic girl, but I have been recruited by some Woods Hole people who are working on a Twilight Zone project. So I'm hoping to get more involved with that. And then I also had the opportunity, I mean, Pete is studies microbes, Gurgis, so I've been working with him for a long time, but then I also sailed recently with Victoria Orphan from Caltech, and she studies these chemosynthetic microbes, and so I'm starting a project with her right now, so I'll be doing like an installation at Caltech in her lab and getting to look at, she uses fluorescence in her research, so it's sort of a really nice match because we both use that. So I'll be actually painting some microbes for the first time. I like, as I mentioned, I like to work from observation, so her giving me the opportunity to get like time on her microscope and paint from that is kind of opening doors for me to actually paint everything I paint pretty much, almost everything relates to chemosynthetic communities. So it'll be really exciting for me to actually like look at the engines of those communities. Yeah.
All right, can we have a round of applause for Lily?